Okay, so today I'm going to do a little takedown on Gary's economics. He did a course he labels wealth inequality. I'm going to go through this thing point by point. I'm going to start out by saying if you want to go watch the entire video on his channel, go do that. This is a 13-minute long video that he did that I had to whittle down to about 4 minutes because there's not a lot of substance here, but he makes a couple of key points that I really think needed to be refuted. So I'm going to bring it up and we're going to get right into it.
This channel, in my eyes, is an educational channel, which is to teach and educate ordinary people about economics. Basically pushing a specific narrative, which is that living standards are falling because wealth inequality is increasing.
Okay, he does two very important things right here. First, he tells you very clearly he's pushing a very specific narrative. I would like to point out that it is not a true narrative. Wealth inequality has nothing to do with rising or falling living standards. Let me illustrate. Two people have one person has a net worth of $100,000, another person has a net worth of $10,000. Let's assume their entire net worth, just for simplicity's sake, is invested in one stock and it's the exact same stock. That stock goes up 10% in value. Guy with $100,000 now has 110 grand. Guy who only had $10,000 now has $11,000. Guess what? The inequality gap actually grew. Wealth inequality has increased, but person B, who only had $10,000, is still wealthier. He is still better off than he was before that happened. Point B is, what's he talking about reduced living standards? What does he mean? What is his time frame of reduced living standards? Was he talking about, look, over the last 5 years, there's no question. Inflation has hurt people. It's made things more expensive. There's no question about it. But what time frame is he talking about? You want to talk about 40 or 50 years ago? 30 years ago even? But 40 or 50 years ago? You think they had a higher standard of living than us? We live in nicer houses, drive nicer cars, we work less hours, we have more leisure time. We certainly have access to technologies that they couldn't have even imagined. Our standard of living, compared to people from 40 or 50 years ago, is significantly higher, period. And the further back you go, the bigger that gap gets. I'm being generous with 40 or 50 years. You go back 70 years, 100 years, it's not even comparable. We are living in one of the best possible times to be alive right now.
And video number one is going to be called What is Wealth? What is wealth? Wealth is about ownership of things, of assets. Now, the most practical and close to ordinary people's lives example of wealth is housing. So some people own their own house they live in. Some people don't own their own house they live in and they rent their house. Some people own their house with a massive mortgage. Some people own their house with a very small or no mortgage. This is the most obvious example of how some people have wealth and some people don't. If you own your house with no mortgage.
That was dynamite, by the way. I hope you all now understand how housing works.
You don't need to pay interest. You don't need to pay rent. You simply can live in that house essentially for free. I think what people...
So no, it's not for free. It's free now. But it's free for a reason. It's free because the person who pays off his house had a time preference for money. And he said, I want to have more money down the road. And so I'm going to bypass some other things and pay down my mortgage and pay off my house. I'm not going to refinance it. I'm not going to expand upon it. I'm going to make sacrifices today so that I can own my house free later in life. But he also made a decision to live most likely below his means, which means I could have bought a bigger house, I could have bought a nicer car, I could have bought more clothes, I could have been out to dinner or vacations more, but I didn't do that. Instead, I directed my disposable income towards paying down this mortgage, and I lived a life where I knew I would have disposable income. So this is pretty important. It's not free. A price was paid for it.
People often fail to realize is that there is much more wealth other than housing in our society. So I'm looking out here through this window, I can see Whitechapel, there's a massive hospital right there, that's Royal London Hospital. That's worth an enormous amount of money, it's owned by somebody.
And he goes on for this, with this list, he just keeps looking out his window going, that's a thing that's worth money, somebody owns it, that's a thing that somebody owns it, he does it like 10 times, so I cut that out.
That's a form of wealth. Now, what is interesting about commercial wealth is ordinary people don't normally own it.
What is ordinary people? That's an interesting thing. I'm not going to accuse him of manipulation here, but it's a very interesting choice. It's a very us versus them way of looking at the economy. This is one of the things that they, when I say they, I mean leftist economists, try and do is pit this class struggle. They're all socialist, Marxist, communist type folks, and they're trying to create this us versus them, we live in two different economies way of viewing the world, which is really a bad way to look at things.
Right. Ordinary people are often struggling to own their own home.
Okay, wait a minute. Sorry, we're not going to let this slide. Why? Why, Gary's Economics, are people struggling to own their homes? If they're going to be having an honest conversation about wealth inequality, then you have to include information about why. Again, time preference, risk aversion, skill, IQ, work ethic. There are reasons people are struggling to own their own homes. And we have to talk about it. We have to have an honest conversation about it. Doesn't mean that policy isn't part of the equation here. Doesn't mean that even, private industry buying up resources, but there's more to it than just people are struggling. We have to talk about this. We're going to have a course on economics. We have to examine these issues. We can't just gloss over what's going on in the economy. We actually have to have a conversation about it. But having a real conversation about it doesn't fit the narrative.
They don't consider when they go to work in an office, or whether they go to shop in Tesco's, or whether they go to a restaurant, that these commercial buildings are also owned as well. Now, this is a massive part of wealth. And the fact that ordinary people often don't own their own homes, but very often don't own a significant chunk of the commercial property, tells us another real fact about wealth, which is that property in many cases is owned by ordinary people, by the middle class, but commercial property is overwhelmingly owned by the rich. One other big form of wealth.
Yeah, that's true. Commercial property is overwhelmingly owned by the wealthy. There's no question about that.
Which is important to recognize is debt. One thing you need to understand is that debt always.
I'm going to pause this here because this is actually pretty valuable. This is a nice little piece of information.
Out. If one person is in debt, another person is in credit. There are a lot of misunderstandings about wealth. Firstly, a comment we often get is, no, actually, ordinary people own the commercial property, they own the debt through their pensions. And to a tiny degree, this is true. If you have a pension, if you have some savings, you will own some other people's debts. If you own some stocks and shares, you will own some small share of the commercial property, but ordinary people own a very small percentage.
So that's true
as well
as an individual person. But just like, for example, in the United States, the value of the 401ks in the United States is $12.7 trillion. That's active participation in commercial property, in stocks, bonds, debt. That's what's owned in 401k plans. And that's just 401ks. That's not Roth IRAs. That's not rollovers. That's not, just private brokerage accounts. There's a ton of money out there. This idea that everybody's poor and this group of people is rich is not true. It's a false idea. It's a false way of looking at the world. And he's pushing this, but individually the regular people probably own, compared to like a truly ultra wealthy person's portfolio, they own a small percentage, but holistically, a lot of that wealth does exist in the middle class or ordinary people.
Wealth is not about income. Wealth is not about your job. Wealth is about who owns the physical things in your country, the buildings, the property, the natural resources. Ordinary people, in most cases, own only their own property, and in many cases, that's only through debt. All of the rest of the wealth is owned by essentially very wealthy people. And this leads to cash flows. The people who don't own the wealth have to pay the people who do own the wealth in order to use the wealth.
But they didn't have to create the wealth. And this is what gets overlooked. I don't know if leftists don't know where wealth comes from or how wealth is created, but they didn't have to create the wealth. They didn't have to figure out how to build the house or the pub or the stadium. They may have worked on those specific things, but they just had to show up and participate in an infrastructure that was pre-built for them, trade some of their time and skill, and then access all of these things. So one guy may spend 8 hours a day working on a house, but then afterwards, when he goes to the pub, he didn't have to build the pub. When he goes to the stadium to watch a game, he didn't have to build the stadium. When he goes, takes a trip, flies on an airplane, stays in a hotel, none of that stuff did he have to build. When he goes to a restaurant to eat, he didn't have to grow the food. He didn't have to build the restaurant. He doesn't have to participate in any of the creation of all this other wealth. He trades some of his time for some money, and then he gets to access all this other wealth that has been created. So yes, he's giving money to rich people, and the majority of the money he's giving to rich people, he doesn't have to give to them. He can keep that money. He doesn't have to go to the restaurant. He doesn't have to go to the game. He doesn't have to go to the stadium. He could keep all that wealth, and he could invest it instead of spending it. Instead of cash flowing it to rich people, he could just hang on to it, buy stocks, buy bonds, get involved in the marketplace, and start owning portions of this. Most, quote, ordinary people aren't making that decision on a day-to-day basis, which is why they don't own a significant portion of the wealth individually and why they don't become wealthy in the long run.
The most obvious example of this is if you don't own your own home, you will have to pay rent to the person who does own your
But you didn't build the home, and you don't have to maintain the home.
home. If you do own your home, but using a massive mortgage, you'll have to pay interest to the person who does own your mortgage.
Yeah, and ideally, what you're going to do is live below your means, pay as much as you can, as fast as you can to reduce the interest payment, reduce the cash flow to the rich person, and own that asset as quickly as you possibly can. But again, a lot of people bypass that choice for short-term benefit and long-term.
And we spoke about the commercial property, so this
know.
extends all through the commercial property. So when you go shopping at Tesco, part of the money that you pay will go to the owner of that physical building.
And I know people don't like people who own property for some reason, landlords or whatever the case may be, but yeah, somebody owned that building. So they built it so that you would have a place to go and get groceries. Why do we not think about that part of it?
The Tesco superstore is based in. Some of it will go not just to the farmer who maybe produced the food you buy,
but some of
also
it's going to
the
go to
landowner.
that farmer. I don't think we begrudge the farmer, and I don't think we want to do the farmer's job. So good for the farmer who owns the farmland, who grows the food. Good for him. Thank you for owning that land, owning that wealth, and growing something that I get value out of. But thank God farmers own land and grow food so that I can access it, because I don't want to grow food.
Who owns the land. Some of it will go to the people who own the energy resources that transported the food to the supermarket, which means there is a big net flow of cash every day, every week, every month, every year, from ordinary people who don't own much wealth to very rich people who do own wealth.
So yeah, that's true. That's how that works. All these other things in society are provided for you by people who own other assets. You trade a small amount of your time. They give you something of value that you can then exchange for other things of value. And your individual economic decisions will determine how much you get to participate in wealth ownership versus being a person who just gives money to rich people. That's your decision. But we should all be very happy that there are people who are managing resources, and I can go to a supermarket and buy food. He almost makes it, he makes it sound like a negative, this distribution of resources through the economy and the specialization of labor, as if it's a negative. It's a net benefit to society. We are all better off because this is how the economy functions, all of us. And so this idea of wealth inequality being a problem is false. It's a lie. And I'm tired of hearing it. And I wish I was more talented at YouTube and I could do a better job speaking out against it. But if you subscribe, comment, encourage me to keep going, I will continue to get better at this content and put more of it out. Thank you very much for coming by, and we'll see you next time.